the right balance. If you've got a situation with a fender bender and $8,000 worth of property damage, it seems a particularly inefficient system where you would make 12 people miss a day of work to decide that issue involving $8,000 worth of property damage. We have good judges in the state of Louisiana. Our electorate, we're all told all the time, is very conservative. Why would we think our judges are not? And so I don't see a need to reduce the jury trial threshold, and certainly I have a record on this issue in the legislature over the last 8 years, all of which have been on the Civil Law Committee.
Thank you for that question. Before I give you my answer, let me again go back to history right here. It was then State Representative David Vitter who voted for the very bill that raised it from what it was to $50,000. Not only did he vote for it, he claims to be against it now, but he voted for it, and he was the 53rd and final vote to make that bill become a reality in the House of Representatives. Now he says he's against it and he has a different approach. What I would say to that is that we ought not be clogging up our judicial system with additional trial opportunities. I think the system is working when you take a look at the fact that bringing any number of people into a jury pool, and I know how difficult it is in my home parish to even sit a jury pool. I believe that the system has worked. We ought not clog it up. We ought to leave the docket available to use as much as we can to treat some of the criminal backlog that we have in this state, and I think the system has worked okay.
Next question.
The Department of Environmental Quality does not receive any general fund money. As of now, they do not have the money to support a mercury monitoring program, which would be mercury in all your lakes and rivers where people fish. And they do not have funds to adequately do air monitoring as we bring in more chemical plants to the state. Would you support increasing fees for the Department of Environmental Quality as was done by DNR last session?
I've been asked to repeat the question. The question is, I understood, would we be in favor of increasing fees at the Department of Environmental Quality so that they would have the revenue necessary to do more compliance checks with respect to mercury in lakes and air monitoring with respect to quality of air, especially in light of all of the expansion of existing chemical and petrochemical facilities. I hope I did a fair job of repeating the question. First of all, we have to look at what we're doing and what we're not doing and whether there is existing revenue sources available to cover these. Obviously, it's very important that we make sure that water is safe and that our air is safe and that we're not poisoning our children and other people here in Louisiana. And if they don't have any state general fund revenue, maybe it's time that they have some if it's available, but that's a problem that exists in all state agencies. When you have 7 straight years of budget cuts, this most recent one, $1.6 billion in terms of a revenue shortfall. By the way, 5 more such revenue shortfalls are projected, and the only reason it's 5 is because that's as far out as we project. There's a structural budget deficit. Obviously, we have to fix the situation with respect to revenue if there's going to be any general fund revenue. But it's a critical component of what DEQ should be doing to make sure that we are monitoring the environment. It's the Department of Environmental Quality. If we can't determine that the environment has the quality that we want it to have, then clearly they're not performing their key functions.
Of course, a fee is designed to provide revenue for the services that are rendered as a result of the fee being imposed. So to the extent that there would be a fee imposed to do a particular service that there's not money to do right now, I would certainly be open to doing that. You can't look at a fee, though, as a means of funding the entire operation of a department because that's not what a fee is all about. So limited to the purpose of providing services that are not now needed for mercury or for air quality, yes, I'd certainly be willing to look at that if it was reasonable. And we'll be looking at the structure of everything we do in government. We obviously have a challenging time right now with the revenue coming into the state and where we are and where we really want to be. So I think we're going to be open to looking at all those kind of questions, but just make sure that a fee is not more than it should be because it's going to be assessed against a user to make certain that it provides a particular service.
before we would look at any fees, I believe it is absolutely critical that the governor, working with the legislature, go through again two things. We have diverted about $2 billion away from the general fund for a variety of special projects, for a variety of special things, that in many cases, we can't answer the question whether or not those meet a statewide priority. Certainly, mercury testing is a statewide priority, and I assure you there are things in the budget that we are funding that are not as important as that. And so what I would say is that we need to do is have leadership and take a hard look at what we have funded in other areas and make sure that that money is available. The second thing, as I said earlier, there's no document in the state government that gives us an idea of what we are giving away in terms of tax credits and tax rebates and tax exemptions. $7.5 billion a year. If we will put those through a program and a process, I'm certain we can find the money that we need to test for mercury.
Can you all each give us one either tax credit, rebate, incentive program that you would look at changing? I want one specific one that is not the solar tax credit. What's that?
Well, the question's a good one, and I suspect you don't want the solar because it involves a small amount of money and because it's already set to go out in 2017, right? So it doesn't, look, if you look at my record in the legislature this past year, you see that I was willing to vote in order to put a cap on certain tax credits, but I was also willing to vote in order to reduce the amount of available credit on a broad array of tax credits and rebates because it's the right thing to do. That's the approach I'll take as governor as well. As you know, the time limitation on these revisions that we did this last year were 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, all of those reductions in those tax credits will expire. So we're going to have to work to make sure that we look at all of these and go forward in a way that makes sense because the structural deficit extends beyond the 3 years. And the only reason we stopped it at 3 years is because we were sure that Grover Norquist would score it a little better for Bobby Jindal. So clearly that won't be anything that's important to me because I have not and will not sign a pledge to Grover Norquist or anybody else about these matters. But yeah, we have to look at all of them. I think we have to look at the motion picture investor tax credit and moving that to a front-end cap instead of a back-end cap and the total. I'm sorry, I'm being told to stop now. Thank you.
It's interesting because there's a continual question. Give us one. Just give us one that you'll do. I'm going to answer your question and give you one as an example. The horizontal drilling tax credit is one that we ought to look at reducing. Right off the bat, I can say that because it was an appropriate incentive at the time when this was a new part of industry. It's not as much anymore. But having said that, what I've said all along from the beginning, we've got to look at every single one of them. And we ought to do it in the context that I've advocated before, reduce the personal income tax rates, the corporate income tax rates, and when we do that, every exemption, every credit, every exclusion is on the table to be looked at to see how it can be, we don't have to provide that anymore because we're reducing the rates. That's going to make businesses looking at Louisiana in a much more favorable way than our 8% corporate tax rate, which is the highest in the South. And it will give us a chance to say, okay, we're going to lower your rates, and we're going to look at some of these other exemptions and exclusions. They all have to be considered. Some of them perhaps need to be abolished. Some of them, probably all of them, need to be ratcheted down in some way if we're going to deal with the problems we're facing in balancing this budget. And we've got problems coming our way in the future. We've got problems coming our way in this fiscal year. The special session that we'll have in early 2016 will deal with the fact that we've probably run out of money in this fiscal year, not next.
Thank you, Julie, for that question. I think the question goes to the exact problem that we've had now for 20 or 25 years. You know, at the end of the day, the governor and the legislature will ultimately make the decision, as so they should, on the tax credits and the exemptions and the rebates. But they need to be informed decisions, and we need economists in the room helping us inform the decision of return on investment. It ought not be an emotional decision of which one I like or which one Jay likes or which one John likes. You know, it ought to be driven by research. It ought to be driven by folks like James Richardson, Dr. Richardson, I've reached out to him. He's agreed to help. I've met with him on several occasions. He has put out a document that certainly begins to address some of those issues from an economical standpoint. And I just think it's important that we can point to the people of Louisiana, we can point to a document for the people of Louisiana and say, this is the return on investment. It's not who I like or who I don't like. But certainly I think moving tax credits needs to be capped, and that would be one of the things that I will work on.
The Baton Rouge Area Chamber and others have criticized all three of you for not being specific about how to tackle the $12 million backlog on roads and bridge needs. This was the subject of the very first forum back in January. Do you have specific plans in mind if you become governor on how to tackle the bridge and highway needs, not just in Baton Rouge, but just statewide?
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, be specific about addressing the $12 billion backlog on highway, roads, and bridges. What is it you're going to do? Obviously, we've all talked about how we make some changes in setting priorities in the Transportation Trust Fund, and I think that's absolutely where we start. We make sure the Transportation Trust Fund goes to transportation. You do save some money by making sure that not a bigger portion is carved out for state police and not a bigger portion is necessarily going to the parish transportation fund. I have said the other way to tackle it is to make it a priority in the capital outlay budget so that we're going to provide particular projects in capital outlay a much higher percentage than we have right now to go to the backlog and the problem of preventive maintenance and road repair. That is not going to address the long-term issue of what we do about major projects that need to be addressed in Louisiana. That's a separate problem. That's something we're going to be talking about. There's no question. We got to figure out a way, if we're going to ever finish 49 North, 49 South, the problems in Baton Rouge, we got to figure out a way to pay for that long-term, and that's something we'll be talking about. I have also made suggestions on what we can do to create another exit on Washington Street here in Baton Rouge that'll provide at least a little bit of relief to the backlog coming off of I-10.
Well, I believe the only way to move past where we are now is to decentralize DOTD, create a situation where perhaps we have regions of 10 or so parishes, perhaps 6 regions in the state, and we quit waiting on Washington to solve our problems. And in a lot of ways, we unshackle local governments to solve some problems. You know, we shouldn't wait on Washington to make ourselves great, and the 64 parishes shouldn't have to wait on the dysfunctional DOTD to make ourselves great. I think it's we've done a poor job of driving everything to state government and not giving enough authority to our local governments. I think if we can create regions and give them the opportunity to look at revenue by vote of the people, only by vote of the people. I think tolls need to be a part of it. I think the capital outlay bill needs to be a part of it. I'm going to provide a leadership as the only guy in this race that's ever built a road as a former parish president, that when we actually build roads and we actually invest in ports, we do more than move people and cargo from point A to point B. We actually create an economy.
Well, the simple fact of the matter is that early this year we had a forum that dealt with transportation infrastructure issues. I stated at the time we needed to get the state police out of the Transportation Trust Fund. $60 million last fiscal year went to the state police and Department of Public Safety. The governor actually proposed to increase that to $72 million in the current year. I was against that, voted in the legislature, and in fact, the state police now have the ability to remove themselves entirely from the Transportation Trust Fund. That $60 million stays for roads and bridges and ports. I've additionally said that I would allocate an additional 25% of the capital outlay budget every year for transportation infrastructure needs. That's an additional $75 million. Beyond that, we will look for public-private partnerships, study the feasibility of tolls, and only when we get to that point and we see that we don't have enough revenue necessary to address the backlog, we will then sit down and look at an additional tax, whether it's another dime on the gas tax, which has been proposed. We'll take a look at it at that point.
In the last few years, the agriculture and forestry budget has been so devastated until the agriculture department and forestry cannot adequately fight potential wildfires. How can y'all do something about that?
Again, ag and forestry are a very, very big part of our economy and deserve to be treated better than a situation where there's no money available to fight fires, right? So again, it goes back to the decisions that we've made. We, as a state, over the last several years, over the last decades, have chosen to divert money away from the general fund through a practice of statutory dedications on one hand. On the other hand, we have chosen to give away a variety of tax credits and rebates without a thoughtful process. The reason